last piece that we're going to cover in this unit is another chapter out of the very short introduction to environmental ethics by Robin Attfield. And this is the chapter on sustainability and preservation. He started by talking about, broadly speaking, sustainability refers to the capacity for something to persist or be practiced indefinitely. I just want to preface this. You're going to notice some differences in how he talks about sustainability to how Dr. DeRoche talked about it in his article. So just be conscious of that. You might consider things like how growth of production and population can be balanced and sustained, taking into account ecological limits. Sustainable practices are concerned with providing for the needs of future and current generations and balancing those two. So sustainability is not necessarily good on his account. He thinks morally bad practice can be sustainable because he's only using the non-normative understanding of sustainable. He's only talking about sustainability in terms of persistence through time. But he acknowledges that generally sustainability is concerned with practices that will continue to produce benefit generation to generation. He's acknowledging that though the technical definition of sustainability doesn't have this normative component, how we use it typically does. So this kind of approach places limits on the treatments of things as resources for immediate consumption. A lot of times when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about ways in which we can limit consumption now so that these things can persist into the future. Concerns with sustainability paired with a desire to further develop, to decrease things like poverty, hunger, and disease lead to an interest in sustainable development. A lot of times you might think trying to increase development, do things that increase standard of living, decrease hunger, work through innovations that improve health, these kinds of things, technological advancement, things that we consider are human goods for current generations and future generations might be in conflict with other sustainable goals, like figuring out how to put in practices that will protect natural resources for future generations. A lot of sustainability is trying to balance these things. And to balance these things, there's kind of been an interest in sustainable development. So one definition of sustainable development that we've already talked about in DeRoche's piece, the Brundtland report, kind of defines sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The case made in their report for adopting certain sustainable practices, both on anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric grounds. It can be argued for using anthropocentric or non-anthropocentric grounds. So this is just basically saying it doesn't matter if you're starting from an anthropocentric or a non-anthropocentric perspective, you can still think that sustainability is something we should aim for, and you can still accept this definition of sustainability and sustainable development. Okay, one of the criticisms of sustainability is that it does not necessarily put limits on substituting natural entities for artificial ones. The idea here being that there is nothing in sustainability necessarily that would keep us from developing completely artificial means of meeting future generations' needs at the expense of all natural ones. And this has been what he calls weak sustainability. So I think here of the movie The Lorax that was done a couple years ago, and how they've ingeniously come up with all sorts of artificial systems that meet human needs. So on a weak understanding of sustainability, that would be perfectly sustainable as long as future generations are able to meet their basic needs. That could meet the definition of sustainability. But clearly, as shown in the Lorax, we tend to think that something is lost when we substitute artificial means for natural ones. And so there is some criticism that this weak understanding of sustainability doesn't give enough credence to that, doesn't pay enough attention to that loss. Okay, instead, we should set limits on substitutions, limits on how much we can destroy natural things and substitute them with artificial ones. And this is a stronger understanding of sustainability. But then there are concerns about the resources it would take to do so and pulling resources away from immediate relief to suffering humans. As with all things, it's complicated because sustainability is broadly concerned with the needs of current and future generations. There's a lot of times where we're really in conflict about, okay, how do we balance addressing current humans' issues and problems and needs and with taking away resources that could be devoted to that, but putting them towards things that are also important to future generations, like trying to have natural systems and not destroy natural systems. However, there's a more ethically defensible approach to the aim at the deeper goal of pursuing both things like poverty reduction and natural preservation together. He's acknowledging that even though this is complicated, a more defensible aim of sustainability is trying to pursue things like poverty reduction and natural preservation together. So not seeing them as in competition, but seeing them as mutually beneficial and trying to figure out ways to do both things. There's a strong emphasis on aiming at sustainable practices and development in the new millennium. So he's moving on to talking about those initiatives and the history of sustainability in a brief way. Sometimes current issues need to be addressed as a precursor to adopting sustainable practices. This was reflected in a lot of the initiatives that happened at the millennia. There was a focus on current problems and seeing those as needing to be addressed in order to move on to more future facing or environmental preservation, these kinds of sustainable goals. One important initiative is the Millennium Development Goals, which set certain international targets to be achieved by 2015. Of the 8 goals, some targeted current issues like promoting gender equality, eliminating hunger, promoting primary education, while others aimed at environmental sustainability. Some of the goals have been attained, but it is widely held that they were not sufficient. There were issues with the implementation. It seemed like some of the Millennium Development Goals were reached, and that was good, but it wasn't really sufficient. Okay, in response to the kind of patchy progress made by and towards the Millennium Development Goals, adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 was proposed. So these goals were supposed to kind of slot in after the Millennium Development Goals were supposed to be reached in 2015 and be broader and less patchy. The goals were meant to capture the 3 dimension of sustainable development: the environment, the economy, and the social, and then their interconnections. So these goals included 169 targets with 17 central goals, and it was open as to if it was for the sake of human interest or for the sake of non-human interest as well. So again, there's a lot of kind of moves in sustainability that are agnostic on the question of, does this have to be just for human interest or can it be for non-human interest as well? There's some concern that some of the SDGs conflict with others. For example, those aiming at reducing poverty and those aiming at environmental preservation. But it's generally considered unlikely that a balance can be struck, since a practice can only be considered sustainable if it doesn't undermine other sustainable practices. So there's a concern when we look at sustainable goals and think like, oh gosh, it seems like some of these actually work in opposition to each other. And his point is maybe at a superficial level, but it can't be the case that a truly sustainable practice would undermine other truly sustainable practices. So we probably just haven't come to the right practice yet. When we're considering policies and how to advance towards these goals, there has been a lot of debate on the SDGs, but it is generally held that having goals to aim at as an international community is more likely to galvanize action, including individual participation as a form of global citizenship. So he defines global citizenship as holding that people everywhere have rights and that they have responsibilities that transcend national borders, including things like addressing environmental issues. This notion of global citizenship is that our responsibilities are not just bound by the political community that we're a part of. They transcend borders, and we do have responsibilities to protect rights of people in other countries. And we also have responsibilities that maybe transcend borders, particularly environmental responsibilities. Attfield then goes on to address ecological preservation by pointing out that there may be many people who accept the need for SDGs aimed at things like ending poverty and hunger, but are less compelled by goals aimed at the preservation of things like biodiversity. So to answer this question, he focuses on what makes biodiversity loss a global problem and what forms of preservation should be pursued. Um, he talks about here how wonder and a desire to preserve environmental aspects for aesthetic, historical, and scientific interests are one form of motivation for ecological preservation. However, it's not the only form. There has been a striking loss in terms of species extinction and global change, such as the loss of whole ecosystems and deforestation. And he thinks that these losses may be motivating. Other arguments can be made along the lines that living nature is a sort of genetic library, and the destruction of ecosystems is like burning libraries of books that will never be read. This argument relies on some sort of value being ascribed to scientific study and the importance of knowledge to human flourishing. There's a related argument about the potential of life-changing discoveries to be made in wild places. For example, new medicines from undiscovered plants, or new agricultural innovations from new species of plants or forms of pest control. These arguments are all human-centric and that they ground out how ecosystems and environments might serve human interests in different ways and valuing that and using that as motivation for protecting them. Let's include an argument about how humans rely heavily on the self-regulating properties of ecosystems for our survival. So if we're compelled by arguments that extend moral value past humans, then all these reasons for viewing ecological degradation as a global problem become even more compelling. He's not taking the approach of trying to give us one reason why we should care about biodiversity loss, why we should care about sustainable development goals that aim at environmental issues. He's basically saying there are a large range. Pick one. You will probably be motivated by at least one of these. And if you are, then you should care about the sustainable development goals that are aimed at environmental sustainability. And he's saying that's only the human-centric ones. So if you're compelled by the idea that moral value extends past humans, then you're going to have even more reasons to think that we should aim for these goals. In the final section of this chapter, Attfield discusses different forms and limits of preservation. So there's been a wide range of efforts toward reestablishing biodiversity, encouraging biodiversity, and the restoration of degraded ecosystems in different places. However, it's obviously not always possible to restore ecosystems to their state prior to human intervention, in part because ecosystems are never static. Additionally, it's not feasible given limited resources to attend to preservation in all places at all times. Therefore, preservation has to be selective. There's also the question of what state of ecosystems should we be aiming for? Sometimes modified areas can have more biodiversity than their pre-modified versions. Sometimes human intervention has actually led to more biodiversity. And there's a lot of questions about what to do when an ecosystem has been changed drastically because of an invasive species. There's a general consciousness that when we consider future generations, there may be more weight that needs to be placed on the flourishing of native populations than invasive ones, but there's still a lot of questions about, okay, what do we do when an ecosystem has reached a new equilibrium that includes an invasive species? What is the right thing to do there? What does it mean to preserve? What does it mean to aim at biodiversity in these cases or to aim at the health of an ecosystem? Therefore, there are some concerns with a broad-based acceptance of the goal of ecological restoration or rewilding. Instead, many argue for a more balanced approach with some ecological restoration, some acceptance of novel ecosystems that have been changed by human interference, but now seem to have reached a new equilibrium. So he's basically ending by saying, like, it's a little bit unclear, or there's a lot of different ways that we might approach health in the environment, even when we're just looking at the issue of biodiversity. But it seems like the most compelling is probably going to be some mix. It's not going to be trying to rewild every area that we've messed with. It's going to be some form of tending to the new environments that have come to be and rewilding those that we can, and just encouraging biodiversity where we can in kind of taking a case-by-case basis.